Thank you for tuning into the history of North Shore Golf, brought to you by Canal Shores and presented by Dave Melsheimer. A century ago, golf pro and Evanston civic leader Peter Jans established a golf course, reclaiming the banks of the North Shore Channel with the vision of golf accessible and affordable for all. Known today as Canal Shores, the community course is beloved by many. Generations of golfers who learn to play here, neighbors who enjoy the abundant green space, ecologists who commend Canal Shores' commitment to a healthy, biodiverse ecosystem, and esteemed golf pros and designers who appreciate the challenge and character of this iconic course. There is no shortage of admiration for Canal Shores, but for the course to continue as it has for 100 years, it is now necessary to convert that goodwill into financial support. Many people, including players, neighbors, and aficionados, are unaware that Canal Shores is a nonprofit organization that receives no municipal funding from Evanston or Wilmette. It is dependent upon philanthropic giving, above and beyond green fees, to survive and thrive. Thanks to a devoted staff and hundreds of volunteers, Canal Shores looks and plays better than any time since its inception. The ecology has dramatically improved and the community course welcomes more golfers, youngsters, neighbors, and outdoor enthusiasts to its 82 acres of green space than ever before. It is a golf course without parallel, a neighborhood treasure, an incubator for skills and confidence, an urban oasis. In truth, it has been so focused on meeting community needs, it hasn't always adequately conveyed its own ever-growing need for support. Robust support from individuals and corporations who cherish Canal Shores is necessary if the legendary course is to continue to serve the community. Without this investment, the future is uncertain for Canal Shores and for the green space it has called home for 100 years. Please consider making a donation at canalshores.org. And without further ado, I would like to introduce our esteemed speaker tonight. David Melsheimer is a 50-plus year resident of Chicago's North Shore. Having grown up in East Wilmette, he often played the Peter Jans course in his youth. Dave is the club historian at the Michigan Shores Club in Wilmette. He has published numerous articles on the original Wilmette Country Club and its eventual transformation into the Michigan Shores Club. In addition to his duties at Michigan Shores, he is also a member of the Chicago Golf Heritage Society. Dave, the floor is yours. Thank you.
And really, during that period of time, for all intents and purposes, the city is considered a very unsafe place. And so suburbia and burgeoning suburbia and, the sort of idea of more country living and safer living really sort of permeates the scene in sort of the Chicago area. And so you see massive growth in suburban populations. So with that in mind, around that same time, you have 1886, you have the Haymarket Riots, right before the turn of the century there. Really, that's when the beginnings of golf are starting to happen in and around Chicago. And one of the things, I'm an East Wilmette, guy born and raised, and I'm now a transplant to Lake Forest. And one of the interesting things about Lake Forest is you really can't avoid talking about the origins of North Shore golf without talking about Lake Forest, and you really can't avoid talking about the Untitled Club. That's really ground zero for golf on the North Shore. And so I think one of the things that's interesting is that the first course that was laid out in Lake Forest was actually laid out by C.B. McDonald himself. And there's a gentleman in Lake Forest who's a wonderful writer and member of the Untitled Club by the name of David Sweet. And I don't know if any of you saw it, but if you didn't, please take a look. It's in the CDGA newsletter, I believe, for this past month. He wrote a lovely article on Wensia at 125 years old, where he talks about the fact that in 1892, C.B. McDonald came to Lake Forest. And C.B. actually laid out a course at a private home. And that home was owned by a gentleman by the name of Farwell. And Senator Charles Farwell had an estate called Fairlawn that still exists today. And the golf course was laid out where Forest Park is today, which is sort of the park at the top of the bluff in Lake Forest. And there apparently was a 7-hole course that was laid out over 20 acres in 1892. And this was really laid out at a private residence for the use of family and friends, from what I understand. And so as early as 1892, even before McDonald lays out Chicago Golf Club the next year, you have this golf course on a private residence on the lake in Lake Forest. So really, to me, as a historian, Lake Forest is ground zero for golf in Chicago and on the North Shore in so many ways. And so, one of the other things that happens then the next year in 1893 is we have the World's Fair that comes to Chicago. And we can't really underestimate the power of what happens at the World's Fair to transform Chicago into a modern industrial city. Here you have this terrible fire just a few years before in 1871. You have these terrible riots in 1886. And then in 1893, you have Daniel Burnham and all the wonderful builders and creators that create the beautiful White City. And if you haven't spent any time looking into the White City of the 1893 Columbian Exposition, please do. It's a most marvelous creation. And believe it or not, it is tied into to golf. And so in 1893, a gentleman by the name of Herbert J. Tweedy helped organize an event to highlight the game of golf for the 1893 World's Fair, which was called the Columbian Exposition. It was called the Columbian Exposition to celebrate the 400th year of the discovery of America by Columbus. So in the village of Belmont, which is right off the train line, which is now, I believe, part of Downers Grove, Tweedy, his brother, and C.B. McDonald really introduced the game of golf to the wider Chicago area. So you have this course that's already laid out in Lake Forest, and then they're introducing this concept of golf to this amazing Columbian Exposition and World's Fair of 1893. And this really became what molded into the first 18-hole golf course in all of Chicago and Chicago Golf Course, begun by C.B. McDonald. So the roots of golf in Chicago really are certainly with C.B. McDonald, certainly in Lake Forest. So we've got a very, very strong connection with sort of the original founding of golf in all of Chicago. So if we head back from Belmont, Illinois, Downers Grove, Illinois, to the North Shore, let's go through maybe chronologically and talk about the clubs that existed at the time, when they were founded, who laid out those courses. I think one of the interesting things you're going to find is that there's so many things that are intertwined in these golf courses, whether it's architects, whether it's golf professionals, whether it's notable names. A lot of this stuff really flows from C.B. McDonald and his connections through St. Andrews. So, as I mentioned before, some of these clubs that we're going to talk about don't even exist anymore, and many, many people don't even know that they ever existed. There are homes and churches and buildings on these sites, and people don't realize that in the 1800s, those were indeed bona fide golf courses and private clubs. And some of those clubs now have continued on under different monikers and different names, but some of them have vanished completely. So one of the things you'll notice in sort of this brief overview of golf clubs on the North Shore and golf on the North Shore is a lot of the very notable clubs that you've heard of will not be mentioned. So we won't be talking about Shore Acres or Knollwood or Old Elm or Bobolink or Indian Hill or Westmoreland, because none of those clubs existed prior to 1900. So this is a really sort of a presentation that goes back to the very founding of golf on the North Shore, and really connection to the very beginning of golf in the Chicagoland area and the United States. So, as I said before, really you can't start this without talking about Unwansia Club. David Sweet is, I believe, what we would call the de facto club historian at Unwansia Club. He's a wonderful writer. Take a look at his article on Unwansia Club. But really, Unwansia is ground zero for golf on the North Shore. So in 1894, that course that was built apparently on Senator Farwell's property for family and friends was moved to the McCormick Farm, which is now occupied by the Lake Forest Country Day School, just east of Green Bay Road and Unwansia Road in Lake Forest. And there was a 9-hole course that was laid out there, and at that time it was known as the Lake Forest Golf Club. And not long after that layout, there were complaints apparently about the train being close by, and apparently the McCormicks had sheep that were grazing on the property, and the clubhouse might have been sort of a sheep barn or something that was clearly, according to the golfers, not sufficient. And so the Lake Forest Golf Club went out and purchased a 175-acre farm that's about a 9-iron from that property, and that was the farm of a gentleman named Henry Ives Cobb. And they used his beautiful country farmhouse as their original clubhouse. And in doing so, and at that time, they decided to change the name from the Lake Forest Golf Club to the Unwansia Club. And so there's some debate about who were the actual original designers of the original 9-hole course at the current site at Unwansia. So C.B. McDonald, Robert Folis, who worked under Old Tom Morris at St. Andrews, H.J. Wiggum, who was an amateur golf champion and C.B. McDonald's son-in-law, as well as Herbert Tweedy, who we mentioned earlier, have all been associated with the first design. So according to the Golfer's Green Book in 1901, which was actually published in Chicago, it attributes the design to Wiggum and to Folis. So certainly more research to be done on that topic, but to any extent, Folis worked at Old Tom Morris's shop. His father worked there. His brother worked there, and Folis designed his first course in Scotland in 1899. And he came to America to assist in building this Lake Forest Golf Club in 1895, 1896. And then Tweedy, who was another one that was attributed to this course, was immigrated from England and worked for the A.G. Spalding Company in Chicago. And Spalding was the first importer of golf clubs in America. And Tweedy worked very, very closely with C.B. McDonald. In fact, when the original Belmont site was abandoned by Chicago Golf for their current site in Wheaton, Tweedy actually became the president of the Belmont Golf Club, which was the successor to sort of the original Chicago Golf Club, which is now in Downers Grove. One of the other interesting things about Tweedy was not only did he work closely with C.B. McDonald, but he also employed Tom Bendelow as Spalding's spokesman and resident architect beginning in 1901. Bendelow had worked for Spalding in New York and came to work for Spalding in Chicago. And as you may know, Bendelow's one of the most prolific designers of golf courses. He immigrated from Scotland in 1892, and he began with Spalding in New York and designed over 600 courses over 35 years in the United States. Courses like Medina, courses like Olympia Field. So I think it's interesting. You'll see how all these golf course designers and how all this sort of early golf was tied together. And then H.J. Wiggum was born in Scotland and came to America on a lecture tour. He was brought actually to demonstrate golf in America at the 1893 World's Fair, the Columbian Exposition. And he'd later go on to teach, I believe, English literature at Lake Forest College. And he was a member of Unwansia Club, and he was also a two-time national amateur golf champion. So I think, one of the things that's interesting is sort of the golf history does start in Lake Forest, and you can see sort of the beginnings of all the ties of these folks from Scotland, everyone that's associated with St. Andrews and Old Tom Morris, the Folises, and all the rest. And so if we move on chronologically here from Unwansia, 1895, The next course that we will come to, the next club that we'll come to, chronologically and geographically as we head south, is Exmoor. And so Exmoor was organized in 1896, and the original 9 holes was laid out by none other than H.J. Wigham of the Onwentsia Club, who was instrumental, apparently, in laying out the Onwentsia Club course as well. And that was laid out on 93 acres in Highland Park. And there was a Highland Park Club that existed prior to that, but there was no golf whatsoever. It was apparently purely social in nature. And it was organized in 1896. The first year of operation for Exmoor was 1897. And after Wigham's design, C.B. McDonald was actually brought in to expand and lengthen the course in 1898. And then in 1899, H.J. Tweedy collaborated with club members to expand the course to 18 holes. So I think you can see, just with these quick 2 examples, how tied together early golf course design is with the sort of original group led by C.B. McDonald. And so in 1900, there were actually 3 Exmoor members that apparently took the advice of Tweedy and designed and supervised the club's first 18-hole course. And another really interesting thing to note about Exmoor is before golf was removed from the Olympics for, I believe, over 100 years, 5 of the 10 golf Olympic gold medalists of 1904 played their youth golf at Exmoor in the late 1800s. So Exmoor, as well as Midlothian, had a number of early Olympic gold medalists that grew up at that club. And Exmoor is a wonderful historic club, and my friend Don Holden is the pro there. And if you ever do have an opportunity, he has one of the most extensive and amazing collections of golf memorabilia, Exmoor memorabilia, historical memorabilia about golf in Highland Park and on the North Shore of anyone. If you do get that opportunity, please visit Exmoor. He's done a wonderful job of spreading that history throughout the entire club, and his collection, I would argue, is sort of second to none in the Chicago area. So leaving Highland Park, what's interesting is we sort of jump down, and we jump down to a very little-known golf club. And the town of Kenilworth had a club called the Kenilworth Club. And the Kenilworth Club was founded in 1894 as purely a social club, and social activities were lawn tennis and various parties and celebrations. But as early as 1896, the same year that Exmoor was founded, golf was introduced at the Kenilworth Golf Club. And if you're familiar with Kenilworth at all, if you're standing at the Kenilworth Railroad Station and you head east to where the Church of the Holy Comforter is, that street just to the east of Holy Comforter is called Leicester Avenue. And so that entire parcel from Kenilworth Avenue all the way to the border of Wilmette, east to the lake, was the Kenilworth Golf Club. And it was built on unimproved property. In other words, it wasn't owned by the club, it was lent to the club. This is fairly typical in these days with sort of deep deciduous forest and unimproved property. So it was lent to the club, and they had a wonderful 9-hole golf course where they played up along the lake across Sheridan Road and back. And there was a golf shelter or golf clubhouse right at Leicester, just sort of south of Kenilworth Avenue. And in the wintertime, they would ice that over, and it was the ice skating shelter as well. And so golf really existed extremely early in Kenilworth, from 1896 in East Kenilworth till about 1908, until they moved to the west side of town. But it's one of the sort of hidden golf clubs of the North Shore, and one that has a fascinating history that really, in some ways, continues to this day. So the small clubhouse that was constructed at Leicester, just east or just south of Kenilworth Avenue, was eventually abandoned, and now we know the Kenilworth Club today as a building that was called the Kenilworth Association. So the existing building today was built, I believe, in 1907, and the Kenilworth Club occupies that to this day, and it serves the community. But the golf course vanished in about 1908 due to streets and improvements and development of property. And what's really interesting about the Kenilworth Golf Club is that, according to the Kenilworth Historical Society, the Kenilworth Golf Club, when it has to close due to development, actually moves to West Kenilworth. They lease property west of the Kenilworth Railroad Station, which at the time is completely open land. And in 1908, they have a charter for the North Shore Golf Club. And the North Shore Golf Club has a 9-hole course west of the railroad station, apparently, which eventually becomes an 18-hole golf course, which then eventually, in I believe 1924, if memory serves, moves to their current location in Glenview and is now the North Shore Country Club. So really the roots of the Kenilworth Golf Club in some ways continue on even today. They continued in 1908 as the North Shore Golf Club and moved in the mid-1920s to the site in Glenview and continue on today. But the Kenilworth Golf Club is one of those neat little historical clubs that no longer exists, but was an amazing spot as you played back and forth over Sheridan Road, dodging horse and buggy traffic up until about 1908. So since we're moving along chronologically, we're going to have to go back up north. We're going to go back up to Glencoe up north, and we're going to go to Skokie Country Club. So Skokie was founded in 1897 primarily by Chicago businessmen. And there were many local members, Winnetka, Glencoe members, but it was really founded primarily by a few Chicago businessmen. And there have been a few different layouts at Skokie. We all know this course now, quote-unquote, as a Don Ross course. But the original course, the original 9 holes, was laid out by a member, a gentleman by the name of George Leslie, who was a Winnetka resident. And that course was laid out in 1898, and the course was founded in 1897. And George Leslie's layout, interestingly, stood until Skokie brought in Tom Bendelow to design the first 18 holes at Skokie. And so Bendelow came in 1904, once again tying us back in with McDonald and Tweedy and Wiggum and A.G. Spalding Company. Bendelow came in and designed the first 18-hole layout in about 1904. And, of course, Skokie's the place where the Gene Sarazen won his great Open tournament at Skokie. And so after Skokie, we'll just continue on. 1897, 1896 Kenilworth, 1897 in Skokie, and then 1898 we head back close to Canal Shores Golf Course in Wilmette, and what became the Michigan Shores Club. And that was the original Wilmette Country Club. And the Wilmette Country Club was founded by early Wilmette residents in 1898. And the original clubhouse was right about 9th and Ashland, 9th and Chestnut, somewhere in that vicinity, and very much like the Kenilworth Golf Club, was built on unimproved property. There was a man by the name of Newton Wilson that owned a large portion of forest land that was an original member that lent the land to the club. So they had a little clubhouse in the woods in 1898, and they had a 6-hole golf course that was laid out, and similar to their brethren just to the north in Kenilworth, they had a 6-hole golf course that played across Sheridan Road on the lake. And imagine that course was laid out by none other than Herbert J. Tweedy, the same designer that laid out the Kenilworth Golf Club. So what's interesting about the Wilmette Club is that they had 2 clubhouse fires at the location at 9th and Ashland, and in 1905 they moved the clubhouse to the current location at Lake and Michigan Avenue, where the current Michigan Shores Club stands. So they built a wood frame clubhouse in 1905. One of the members had an option on land there. And what's interesting about this is if we go and we sort of harken back to the name of Wilmette, we talked a little bit about the fact that the land, the 1,280 acres of land that was granted to Archange Wilmette in the Treaty of Prairie du Chien in 1829. Well, in 1829, the Wilmette family, one of the first 4 cabins in Chicago, the Wilmette family of Antoine, his wife Archange, and their 8 children moved to this small cabin along the lake in Wilmette. And that cabin is basically on land that no longer exists, that washed out probably during the Civil War days, that would have stood right in front of the existing Michigan Shores Club. So when the Wilmette Country Club relocates, they use this location purposely to be connected to the original Wilmette cabin, which is on the shores of Lake Michigan. And the Wilmette Country Club stays and remains and carries its name until 1927, when it merges with a club called the Evanston Century Club, which is an athletic club. And then they become the Shawnee Country Club, and later in 1943 they changed the name to the Michigan Shores Club. So the Wilmette Country Club has this 6-hole golf course in 1898, and the course remained until about 1910. And at that point, the land was owned by Northwestern University. It was gifted to Northwestern University, and Northwestern was kind enough to allow our club to play until 1910. And actually, in the board minutes, I have some sightings about a thank you letter that was sent to Northwestern that allowed us to play on the 6-hole course until 1910. And then undoubtedly, some of those Wilmette vehement golfers joined up with the Kenilworth Club folks in the North Shore Golf Club, which was founded in 1908. So once again, you have the Wilmette Country Club, the Kenilworth Golf Club, and the North Shore Country Club all sort of tied together in really early golf history on the North Shore. So the other course, as we head south and as we get much closer to Canal Shores, is the Evanston Golf Club. And Evanston Golf Club, founded in 1897, the course was built out in 1898, and the course was laid out as an original 9-hole course by the Membership Greens Committee. And the original entrance to the clubhouse was somewhere around where Evanston Hospital is today. I found an interesting article in the North Shore News early on about the terrible condition of Sheridan Road from the entrance to Evanston Golf Club all the way up through Lake Bluff. And what's interesting about the Evanston Golf Club, it was 9 holes that stretched all the way from basically almost Sheridan Road on the east side to the Chicago Northwestern train tracks on the west. So from Central Street north, the original 9 holes really encompassed everything from the train tracks east almost to Sheridan Road. And it was, so this is, the part of this property is part crosses over, the part that's closest to Evanston Hospital crosses over, I believe, from looking at just the geography, part of the Canal Shores course that exists today. It's not the same layout. It's it doesn't travel east and west like the original Evanston did. Obviously, the Canal Shores course winds along the canal itself. But one of the reasons that the Evanston Golf Club moved was because from 1907 to 1910, Chicago, the area, they dug this thing called the North Shore Canal. And one of the important things to know about the North Shore Canal is Chicago had these terrible cholera epidemics at the turn of the century because the Chicago River flowed out into Lake Michigan, and the water cribs apparently were out in Lake Michigan. And so human waste was being dumped into the Chicago River out into Lake Michigan, and people were getting incredibly sick. And so it was this incredible engineering marvel, apparently, from what I understand, that they actually reversed the flow at that time, 100 plus years ago, of the Chicago River, and it flowed then inwards towards the Mississippi River. And part of that engineering marvel were the locks that are at Wilmette, and you'll drive over that bridge, with as you head south with with the Wilmette Yacht Club and the harbor on your left-hand side. And so that canal was cut directly through the original Evanston Golf Club. So it was from 1907 to 1911, so apparently people weren't particularly happy, from what I understand, that this canal was being dug through their golf course and interrupting their golf. And apparently a number of members left and started Westmoreland Golf Club in 1911, apparently due to that fact. And the other interesting thing about the Evanston Golf Club was the Evanston Golf Club abandoned that location. And one of the reasons they abandoned that location, from what I understand from Evanston's club historian, was the Women's Temperance Union that was headquartered in Evanston, which of course was a huge supporter of Prohibition. And the club moved apparently west or south of Dempster Street in Skokie/Evanston because Skokie didn't have the same sort of laws regarding alcohol as Evanston did. So that's my understanding of why the Evanston Club finally moved out. And what's even more interesting, though, is that, and what's even less well known, I think, is that there was a women's golf club that was adjacent to the Evanston Golf Club, the original course, which was just west of the Chicago Northwestern Railroad tracks, but just sort of north of Central Street in that area, just west of the train station in Central Street. And it was called the Evanston Kings and Daughters Golf Club. And it was organized in 1899, and it was a 9-hole course laid out over 40 acres. And the course was just adjacent to Evanston. And what's interesting is the 1901 Harper's Golf Guide quotes the purpose of the club as it's maintained for the working girls of Chicago. And so this is really an early example of women's only golf, which I think is fascinating. So not only did you have female wives and daughters of members of the Evanston Golf Club who were members, but you had a very large number of single gals from Chicago that had kind of their own private club just to the west of the railroad tracks in Evanston. And so those are kind of the clubs from north to south that comprise the early sort of North Shore golf. And what's connected and interesting as it pertains to Canal Shores is apparently, as the story goes, a gentleman by the name of Nathan Klee, a gentleman from Highland Park, heard that the Evanston Golf Club was vacating its course, and the Evanston course was moving to its present location, and I believe it was somewhere around 1918. And he had a group of fellows from Highland Park who were looking to establish a golf club. And in 1918, Mr. Klee and his friends approached Evanston about leasing the existing property that would encompass the then 18 holes of Evanston Golf Club. And so the Northmore Country Club, which is now in Highland Park, was actually founded on that exact site. And the following year, the fellows from Highland Park secured their current location and were preparing to move. And according to some of the information that was shared with me from the folks at Canal Shores, there was an article in the newspaper that talked about the fact that the Northmore Country Club was going to maintain 9 of the holes, I believe, in 1919, and the other 9 holes were going to be maintained by this new upstart called the Evanston Community Golf and Recreation Association. And so Northmore apparently maintained their original 9 holes for 1 year, but this apparently is sort of the genesis of the Canal Shores golf course, the Peter and Jan's golf course that I knew growing up. And what's interesting in the article, of course, Peter and Jan's is the treasurer of the Evanston Community Golf Association, which sort of ties it all together. So, I think from the perspective of a historian, you really have an incredibly historic site. First of all, the site of Canal Shores was once part of a bona fide Indian reserve that was set aside by a treaty with the United States government. And in order for that treaty to be nullified, actually I believe it was 1847, the President of the United States actually had to sign off on that treaty being released as the Wilmette family moved westward to Iowa to be with their Potawatomi brethren. And the President of the United States actually had to sign off on this treaty for this land to be transferred into private hands, from what I understand. And so you have this incredibly historic site that part of this golf course north of Central Street is located on, number one. Number two, you have a crossover with the original location of the historic Evanston Golf Club. So this is actually part of the original property that made up the original Evanston Golf Club, founded in 1897 and I believe laid out in 1898. And the other thing that's really fascinating is this course. If this article that was sent to me is correct, you are tied in with the original group of golf club designers in America, with C.B. McDonald and Wiggum and Tweedy, and then Bendelow, who worked for Tweedy for A.G. Spalding, who was the first company to even bring golf clubs to the United States. So, according to the information that was shared with me with the club, Tom Bendelow actually was secured to survey the site and design some of the original features of what you now know as Canal Shores Golf Club. So you have this amazing history of the property, of the design, and really of deep ties to the earliest designers and designs and the earliest sort of proprietors of golf, not only on the North Shore, but in Chicago and in the entire United States. So I think that you have something that's very significant here, and it ties in with something that's much bigger. So I think at this point, Rick, if it's all right with you, since I've droned on for 51 minutes, I would love to take some questions. I apologize if I went through this too quickly, so feel free to fire off any questions that you may have about golf on the North Shore, pre-1900. So feel free.
Anybody have a question out there for Dave?
Hi, my name is Steve Goranson. I live about 3 blocks from Canal Shores. I was one of the 30-year members over there until I changed allegiance. But anyway, I'm still committed to Canal Shores. I know that there was one thing that I had heard that the golf course. One of the original golf courses went all the way over to Dyke Stadium. Is that correct? And that's right. So the original Evanston Golf Club. I actually have a map of the club. If you're interested to see it, and you get in touch with Rick, he can share my email address. I'm happy to share a copy with you. So the original Evanston Golf Club in the 1901 in the 1901 Golfer's Green Book, which was actually published in Chicago, they actually have a schematic of the original layout of the original Evanston Golf Club, and it was indeed in that exact location. Wow. And also, interestingly enough, Peter Jans founded a course not much different in timing up in Plum Lake, Wisconsin, near Manitowoc or Minocqua, just north of Minocqua, and I've played on that course. It's very similar to Canal Shores, actually.
Well, God bless Peter Jans. He was a busy guy.
Hey, Dave, there's a question from Ty Walker, who's a PGA teaching professional in Colorado, and he wants to know how far did they hit their drivers back then?
Well, I wish I could answer that. If the question is, did they hit their drivers further pre-1900 in Colorado versus the North Shore, I'm going to bet on Colorado.
Air is thinner for sure.
Was the routing map for Evanston done by Olmsted Brothers?
The map that's actually published in the Golfer's Green Book, or the actual individuals that laid out the course?
Well, I guess both, to be a little more general, I guess.
Sure. So here's the information that I have. I'm going to pull this up right now on the screen. So the other thing I should mention is a lot of this information, if you're interested in this information, the 1901 Harper's Golf Guide, the 1901 Golfer's Green Book, 1899 Outing Magazine, there are a number of wonderful resources out there where you can sort of discover the history of golf in Chicago. So I show the 1901 Golfer's Green Book lists course laid out by the Greens Committee. Now, let me read you the names of the Greens Committee because I believe it's on here. Frederick Palouse, J.G. Cowling, and F.E. Williams. So apparently, according to the 1901 Golfer's Green Book, those were the three that laid out the original 9 at Evanston.
So, Dave, I've got a number of questions here in the chat.
Sure.
First one was, were women allowed to play at the founding of Peter Jans?
You know what? I have to be perfectly honest. I am not an expert on the history of Canal Shores Golf Club. The information that I have at Canal Shores has sort of been supplied to me by the club. So I don't know the answer to that question. I'd love to know the answer. You know, one of the things that I hope that this would sort of spur was the sort of a dive into deep history at Canal Shores, that it's such an integral part of North Shore golf architecture and design, that hopefully the club can do a deep dive into its own history and discover the answers to questions just like that.
That would be great. Another question, were there caddy programs back then?
I don't know.
Yeah.
Oh, caddy programs in those particular clubs. That's a really good question. I don't know that I'm, the guy to ask, one of the guys that I really wanted to present along with me is a guy that I mentioned before, a wonderful guy, good friend of mine by the name of Don Holton, and who's the 35-year member and the club historian at Exmoor. Don would know the answer to that question off the top of his head. He'd be able to give you the answer to what clubs had him and what clubs didn't. He wasn't able to be with us today. He's actually, because Exmoor was founded in 1896, he's actually extremely busy writing a 400-page coffee table book on the history of Exmoor Country Club 1896, the first 125 years. So I apologize. I don't know the answer to that question.
No worries. Let's see here. They wanted to know, at what point was there a divide between the more affluent country club golf courses and the public courses like Canal Shores?
So it's a really, really tough question. I mean, what you have to understand about the early club courses, I think, on the North Shore, in my estimation, is they really were de facto community golf courses. In essence, these were, they were think about the size of these communities at that time. And these were folks that all, had kids that went to the same schools, they all had similar interests, they all lived in the same town, and the populations were much smaller. So I would argue a lot of these early clubs really were community golf associations in so many ways. I know when it comes to the Wilmette Country Club and Kenilworth Golf Club, this was basically the list of just about everybody who was interested in that sort of thing on these membership lists. So I think difficult to say But I think when you're talking about the early clubs, it was definitely a large group of the community. That makes sense.
Yes. Let's see here. Did the 1894 private course by C.B. McDonald have template holes?
Well, I'm not an expert on C.B. McDonald. I'll tell you what I know, and I'll answer in my own opinion. My understanding is C.B. McDonald thought that there were about 20 great holes in golf, and that was it. So by definition, I'm sure there were template holes. I don't know for sure. That's a great question. If you're talking about the original design in Lake Forest, David Sweet at Unwansia Club would be the guy to answer that question. I don't know, but I know that McDonald was a slave to templates. That's what I can tell you for sure.
Excellent. Thank you. Question about the Women's Golf Club that you mentioned. The Metro tracks, but are they next to Green Bay Road, which probably existed at that time?
I believe so. So the Kings and Daughters, I think, is the one that they're referring to, and I'm looking at the map right now, and Central Street, Lincoln Avenue, Colfax, Grant, and it would appear very apparent that that some road was alongside to the west of those tracks. It doesn't show it definitively, but so I can't say for sure, but it appears to be there.
This is another Canal Shores question, which I'm sure is a tough one to answer. They want to know if the course was ever restricted by race, religion, etc.
I'm sorry. I wish I could answer that. I don't have the knowledge. I apologize.
That's a deep dive for sure. It says, will this presentation be available at a later date? And if so, how can it be accessed? Yes, we did record it. So we'll send out an announcement on our social media as far as how to access that. So to tune into Facebook or Instagram, or if you're on our email blast, you also get a link to that as well. Let me see, did I miss anything? A lot of great comments, great presentation, great history. Great presentation. How about a follow-up on post-1900 clubs, both private and
Right. So I think that's where I'd love to see the club kind of pick up the ball and run with it. I have great fondness for the course with my history in East Wilmette and being the first course that I ever played. I'd love to see the club, pick up and run with it and be able to take that. I think it's a great point to take that history, 1900 plus, roll it up into 1919, and then really have sort of a cohesive presentation on Canal Shores and how that sort of fed up to golf post 1900, because obviously golf post 1900 is an inch deep and a mile wide. I mean, you went from, in 1896 you have 80 golf courses, and I think in 1905 you have 1,000. So it really becomes an inch deep and a mile wide.
Yep.
This is Steve Goranson. I'm on the Eco Board for Canal Shores now. And I'm really happy at the progress of how this is coming out for Canal Shores, and I'm very happy about the way you're sending out invitations and information about Canal Shores and the events and things like that. So keep it up, and I will support you on the Eco group. And very, very happy to join in. I'm one of the youngsters on that, so I know it's a good group, and really happy to join.
Thanks, Stephen. Appreciate those comments. So I know a number of people called in a little bit late, so I want to thank Dave for taking the time to put this together. I think everyone will agree with me that it was fascinating to learn so much about the history in the North Shore as far as it relates to not just golf, but just local history about Chicago and how Wilmette was developed, etc. So as I mentioned earlier, Canal Shores is a nonprofit. We receive no funding from any of the municipalities or our landlord, which is MWRD. And so we'd greatly appreciate any financial support that you can lend to us. We have to raise over 50% of our operational budget every year in order to stay afloat. So it's people like you that are going to be able to help us sustain this for another 100 years. So thanks for tuning in. If you're interested, we're going to try to keep this series going, not necessarily about the history of Chicago golf, but also just golf in general. And we've got a couple other people that we've talked to. And so stay tuned for future announcements about another Zoom meeting from Canal Shores.
Now, all your events are not are postponed, right, or canceled for this?
Yes, due to COVID restrictions, we had to cancel the annual garage party fundraiser. We've had to postpone the Canal Shores Open, and we're hopeful that maybe this fall we can reinstate both of those.
The Murray's First Responders one.
The Murray First Responders was obviously postponed.
That's the one I've been part of. Yeah,
which is a great event and for a great cause.
I love that event.
Yeah, so we're hopeful that maybe this fall, before the snow starts flying, we can do some of those events.
Okay, good.
So stay tuned.
We will. Thanks.
Any other questions for Dave before we let him go?
Thanks so much for having me, everyone. It was a pleasure, and I love Canal Shores Golf Course, and I hope you all support it in any and every way that you can. So thanks so much for joining today.
Great presentation. Thank you.
Thank you.
Oh, thank you.
Thank
Good night,
you.
everybody.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.